All right. It's me again. I don't know who you're expecting, but this will be my last video in this course. Okay. Hold the applause. This is on process safety management still. We're going to, which is 29 CFR 1910.119. And we're going to talk about just two sections of this one. We've talked about all the other ones, all the other, and in the last couple of videos, we're going to talk about two of them. And these are two because they're both, they're both, both kind of fit in with the whole thing that we've been doing in this course with risk management, and their compliance audit and a process hazard analysis. Now, PHA in this is different from a PHA, which was what we've counted before, and this is a process hazard analysis, and it is required, and we're going to talk about it in detail. Oops, when I get back to where I belong. Okay. All right, this element has several sections. Initial PHA requirements, the methodologies that can be used. In other words, you just can't just go, you have to have some kind of methodology to do this thing. What the PHA must address, and update every 5-year requirement. So a system to address the findings and information about the team. You can see I got my little things messed up, but that's okay. That's the things that are required in this section. We're going to talk about each one of those. A retention requirement, which is the life of the process. Pretty simple. So the employer shall perform an initial process hazard analysis, they're calling it hazard evaluation, but on processes covered by this standard. We already know what's covered by this standard and how we do that, okay, and what's exempt. The process hazard analysis shall be appropriate to the complexity of the process. So something that's pretty simple process has a pretty simple analysis, and shall identify, evaluate, and control the hazards involved in the process. Employers shall determine and document the priority order for conducting process hazard analyses based on a rationale which includes such considerations as extent of the process hazards, number of potentially affected employees, age of the process, and operating history of the process. The process hazard analysis shall be conducted as soon as possible, but not later than the following schedule. And so this is because this is back when it started, so we're really not going to worry about this because it's already been done. Those times are past. So process analyses conducted after May 26, 1987, which meet the requirements of this paragraph, are acceptable as initial process hazard analyses. These process hazard analyses shall be updated and revalidated based on their completion date in accordance with E6, which we'll get to in a while because we're still only one. Oh, now we're on E2. The employer shall use one or more of the following methodologies that are appropriate to determine and evaluate the hazards of the process being analyzed. So you have to pick one of these. Well, what if analysis, a checklist, what if checklist, and the what if checklist is kind of the thing that I have used and used at OK Foods doing this. So it's one we're going to talk about. Hazard and operability study, HAZOP, we talked about that. Failure mode and effects analysis, FMEA, we've talked about that. Fault tree analysis, we briefly talked about, not in any detail though, or an appropriate equivalent methodology. So this is kind of, OSHA is kind of giving you an out here. If you can't fit into one of these buckets here, all right, you got something you think is better? There you go, have at it. As long as it does the job, they'll be okay with it, I'm sure. Process hazard analysis shall address the hazards of the process, the identification of any previous incident which had a likely potential for catastrophic consequences in the workplace. So any incident investigation reports would be discussed. They have to be brought up in here. Engineering and administrative controls applicable to the hazards and their interrelationships, such as appropriate application of detection methodologies to provide early warning of releases. Acceptable detection methods might include process monitoring and control instrumentation with alarms and detection hardware such as hydrocarbon sensors. So most places in the anhydrous ammonia business have ammonia detectors in their engine rooms and places where they would be appropriate. So, consequence of failure of engineering and administrative controls. Consequences of failure, we talked about this before too. What happens if these things don't work? What happens if the administrative control, we said we're training people, we don't? What happens if we have engineering control, but they're gone or missing or been taken out. The process hazard analysis shall be performed by a team with expertise in engineering and process operations, and the team shall include at least one employee who has experience and knowledge specific to the process being evaluated. I certainly hope it has more than that, but at least one experience and knowledge specific to the process being evaluated. Also, one member of the team must be knowledgeable in the specific process hazard analysis methodology being used. So he is somebody that's familiar with the methodology and also somebody with the process. Now, sometimes that process, you have to be careful, because if the process is an hourly paid employee who's just an operator and you have them on the team, and they might be easily swayed by a higher people in management, maybe, or their bosses or their boss's boss that might be on the team, that they don't want to do anything, or they won't speak up about it, so they don't want to do anything. They maybe know something that needs to be done, but they won't say anything. So that's something you have to be careful of. Also, one member of the team knowledgeable in the specific process hazard analysis methodology, which we just discussed as methodologies. The employer shall establish a system to promptly address the team's findings and recommendations. So you find some things wrong, what are you going to do? Promptly address them. Assure that the recommendations are resolved in a timely manner and that the resolution is documented. Document what actions are to be taken, complete actions as soon as possible, develop a written schedule of when these actions are to be completed, communicate the actions to operating, maintenance, and other employees whose work assignments are in the process and who may be affected by the recommendations or actions. So once you find out things, you gotta document them, the findings, and get together to figure out who is going to do what and assign responsibility to them, and have a schedule. Now the schedule might be today or tomorrow for something pretty minor, but we had one case where we determined that if we had people up on the roof, refrigeration people, and there was an emergency release in one direction, that was the only direction they could get off the roof. So we had to build an entire staircase and way for them to get off, and it was very expensive and took a while. So we gave us a lot of time on that because the probability was pretty small of something happening. They were outside, so but we did know that something had to be done. So sometimes it might take a while. So it doesn't say you have to have it done by a certain amount of time, but you should say, okay, this is going to be done by this date. And can you get extensions on that? Of course. I mean, you can't predict everything in the future, what's going to happen, get in the way and that type of thing. So, but you have to put it down and review it, and communicate what you've done to the operating, maintenance, other employees whose work assignments are in the process and who may be affected by the recommendations and actions. So if they're affected by it, then they have to know what's going on. And that may just make sense, doesn't it? Employers shall retain process hazard analysis and updates or revalidations for each process covered by this section, as well as a documented resolution of recommendations described in paragraph 85 of this section for the life of the process. So you got to keep these things for as long as that process is going on. So now we're going to take a look at an actual PHA. The format is what if checklist. It's very extensive, so we're not going to cover all of it. But each one of these sections had a heading, and this is a company, and this was kind of given to us by the consultant that we had when we started this thing, Craig Richter. And the company, facility, the date, the leader, the secretary, and the team members, and that should be on. And every section has that in there. And you know what this is? All right. The risk matrix, and I prefer the 5x5 matrix, but this is the one that we use, so I'm going to keep it here. And it was a 4x4, and with frequency ratings of 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. 1 being events affected that occur during the lifetime of the refrigeration system, and multiple instruments or valve failures, and up to events expected to occur yearly with respect to the refrigeration system. So again, these are all kind of subjective and some, but and that's the number kind of makes them semi-quantitative. So, and then you have the incidents. This is the frequency, and this is the incidence, the severity rather. restrict the local vicinity with potential or injuries requiring no more than first aid, up to potential for multiple life-threatening injuries or fatalities. And then they come up with a number, a letter rather than a number, A, B, C, etc. But it's all the same principle. If you've seen one risk matrix, you've pretty much seen them all. Acceptable risk level, evaluate for further action. Action may or may not be taken. Actions are required to reduce consequences and or frequency as soon as practical, but mitigation measures are required. In other words, something has to be done, but you can do something in an interim basis. And then immediate action. If temporary mitigation measures are used at first, these should be replaced as soon as practical with permanent measures and or equivalent procedures. So that's the letters. So now this thing is huge, so we're not going to look at every one of them. We'll be here for a week. But this is the item 1.1, generic compressor. So they're talking about compressors for ammonia. And this particular one, we're going to look at it. And this is the kind of the kind of the what if checklist. The question is like, what if? What if there's no pressure relief valve, hence hereafter SRV, safety relief valve, for safety relief valve on this equipment? In other words, what if there isn't one on this equipment? And then the scenario is an overpressure condition exists and there's no SRV. This causes a leak or rupture resulting in an ammonia release. NH3 is the chemical formula for anhydrous ammonia. And the outcome would be employee injury, employee fatality, equipment damage, community evacuation, product contamination, fire explosion hazard, wastewater contamination, environmental hazard, interrupt production and plant evacuation. Now you can see that particular thing here is kind of boilerplate for the ones that this is. I mean, for a lot of things that go on that could result in something, one of these, not all of them, of course. But so now these are the EA, which is engineering administrative controls. SRVs are installed. Now, this is again this hypothetical situation, but here's now what's been done about it. Safety relief valves are installed on all compressor separators with the exception of one unit. Okay, so that was given a 4, 2, and a B, and the safety relief valve needs to be installed on all compressor separators. This needs to be included as part of the upcoming safety relief system design due in December 2015. So you can see that the relief system was going to be done soon, and so they included this into that, which made a lot of sense. All right. Let's look at 1.3. Again, generic compressor. What does generic mean? In other words, it's a compressor that's not saying an ABC compressor or this type of, it's just generic for all compressors. So this scenario or this other question is, what if the set pressure of the equipment safety relief valve is more than the design pressure of the equipment? So every piece of pressure equipment, boilers, compressors, whatever it is, even air compressors, has a maximum MAWP, maximum allowed working pressure. So the scenario is the pressure rises above the equipment design. The safety relief valve does not lift, which lift means it's open and lets the ammonia out, because the set pressure is too high. The overpressure causes a leak rupture, resulting in a release. And again, the employee injury, all that stuff, it's all boilerplate there most of the time. So then the engineering administrative control is a change out schedule has been documented. And then also safety relief system design is going to be completed by 1/12/115. So that's the whole system design is going to be redone. But a change out schedule is in place to change all these pressure relief valves. And this is because what if the SRV capacity is too low? Well, again, a change out schedule has been documented. So and another thing that's not in here is, on all pressure vessels, the state requires but the insurance company usually ones that do it, a boiler inspector to come around and check all pressure vessels. And we did that. Everyone was on different schedules, so he came 3 or 4 times a year, and I always went with him. And they looked at every one of these things. They looked at the MAWP on the nameplate on the piece of equipment, and then they looked at the relief valve and made sure that they were okay. And so we had a pretty good system in here with those with special safety relief valves being pretty good. So now we're going to talk about it's just still generic compressors. Generic compressors. See, we got 23 different things. What if a compressor here, 1, 2, 3? What if a compressor is hit by a vehicle? It will cause a rupture, right? So we have restricted area and employee training. We restrict the area to certain vehicles. In some cases, you put bollards up. Bollards are those posts that go in the ground and poles that are sturdy and to stop. They'll stop a forklift. And so, but that's one of the. And then also you don't allow forklifts in certain areas. What if valves are not accessible? A valve is not accessible. Attempts by employees to access a valve causes a leak or rupture. A valve is not accessed quick enough in an emergency situation, resulting in a prolonged and a safety release. Now, they're not talking about a safety relief valve. There's not much of a valve that you need to shut to turn off the flow somewhere. And this said all critical valves are accessible. I think down in Havener, we had some that weren't. We had to put in some walkways and ladders and stuff to get to those valves. Because what good's a valve if you can't shut it, right? If you can't shut it, you can't get to it, you can't shut it. So, all right. This is okay. So then it gets down to generic pressure vessels. Generic evaporators, piping. What if piping experiences external corrosion? In other words, starts rusting. That's a problem. Well, they've had a piping. It's about here you have a PM, preventive maintenance program, mechanical integrity audit, bullet 109. Bullet 109 say, what's the name of that thing? American Association of Ammonia Refrigeration, I think it is. And they have these bullet 109s, and we use the bullet 109s to do these audits on our equipment. So, so they could say, "Oh, what if the all right, that's not much. What if automatic control valves are left with jacking stems in the manual open position?" So, all kind of different things. What if the employee emergency notification system is non-existent? And here's your the employee emergency system is non-existent, inadequate, or inoperable during emergency situations. This prevents proper initiation of emergency action, increasing the exposure, and then of course your control is your emergency action plan. And so that's what a process hazard analysis. You come up with as many things that you think could go wrong. Remember, like FMA, the fault analysis. How many things could go wrong, and if it does go wrong, what could happen? And then you look at what can happen, and then you find out how you can prevent that from happening. So it's lengthy. It'll take, for a decent sized company, a whole day to do this because you got to go through each one of these. But once you've done a couple of these things, and then you see that the questions are frequently the same for different types of equipment, but you're thinking about different types of equipment. So, and on each time, but you can, once you've had it a couple of times in your mind, you don't have to go over it in detail anymore. So you can get through things a little faster, but each one of these has to be brought up, discussed, and something done about them. And either you have something in place that's fine, you have training, you have rounds, they call it, where the refrigeration employees make rounds and check all the relief, all the pressures on the gauges and stuff like that, make sure everything is copacetic. And so that's an administrative control. So that's a very good way to do it. Now we're going to talk about compliance audits. Now you might think, what's the difference? Well, there's a good bit of difference. For one thing, the compliance audits are audits by outside agencies usually. Doesn't have to be, but no, the compliance audits are almost identical. I'm thinking off the top of my head. No, I'm not thinking they're not identical in OSHA. It's the 119 is identical in OSHA and EPA. On the compliance audits, the only ones we've ever used were the ones we're going to talk about, which is an EPA, I think a level 3 compliance audit, and when we had inspections at all 3 facilities, it was the EPA checklist that they used. So we're going to look at that. Employers shall certify they have evaluated compliance with the provisions of this section at least every 3 years to verify that the procedures and practices developed under the standard are adequate and are being followed. So it's at least every 3 years. The compliance audit shall be conducted by at least one person knowledgeable in the process. A report of the findings of the audit shall be developed. So here you go, back kind of the same thing. You do the report, what you find, when's it going to be, who's going to be responsible for it, when's it going to be fixed, etc., and follow up on that. So the audit's at least one person audit in the process, because they're not going to get as well. You'll see, as theoretical as the process hazard analysis. The employer shall promptly determine and document an appropriate response to each of the findings of the compliance audit and document the deficiencies have been corrected. Employer shall retain the 2 most recent compliance audit reports. So keep the 2 most recent compliance audit reports. What do you do if you have 3? Get rid of it. The reason being, if OSHA finds it and sees it, and even if it's the third or fourth one and it's still 15 years old, they can cite you for it. So keep your 2 that you're really required to do. There's no set format for a compliance audit. But good idea to use an outside contractor with PSM experience. And then next is the form used by our consultant for our first compliance audits. And this is the EPA. All right. Now they start off here with records review. This written program exists regarding employee participation. Remember we talked about that. There's the reference, C1. That's 29 CFR 119, C1. And okay, this is not the this is just a generic compliance audit, because it refers to these are OSHA, not the EPA. The EPA one refers to EPA numbers. So does the plan include consultation with employees? It just goes down here basically asking about every aspect of the standard. Has written process safety information be compiled prior to conducting any process hazard analysis? And that's 119D. All right. And this yes. Does include physical data, reactivity, corrosivity, that data. This is just, you're just going right through the standard and asking if everything's in the standard, if that's what you're doing. Does include maximum 10-bit inventory? Yes. And then there's the comments. Inventory calculations are conducted and completed according to IIAR guidelines. That's international. I forget what that is. IIAR. It's ammonia refrigeration is the AAR. It's kind of the body that you cover the go-to body for ammonia refrigeration stuff. There's a couple of them, but that's the one we used. IAR. We bought their books and stuff like that. Their training. Does include design codes and standards, ventilation systems, include safety systems. Yes, safety systems are included in the PSI. PSI means process safety information. Here's your 1910 D3I and an H. So, and then here's for interviews. Based on interviews with a representative number of operators, is MSDS. Okay, you can see this is old. MSD information readily available to operators. And the interview is not conducted because the audit team felt they would not add to the success of the audit this time. Well, that's kind of a cop, I think, probably. Does the process hazard analysis address the hazards of the process? Now they're actually auditing the process hazard analysis we just talked about. So is acceptable methodology being used for process hazard analysis? What if checklist methodology is being used? Okay. So there's just kind of one that's the compliance audit is making sure you're compliant with the PHAs. So this is the one that's based on OSHA, and it goes right down through the whole 119.E all the way through is process hazard analysis. Now the EPA uses the RMP, Risk Management Plan Level 3 process checklist. And we use this format internally for some of our subsequent compliance audits. We had the compliance audits done by, of course, our consultant. And then, of course, EPA came in and did them at 3 plants. And after that, though, we would just do them ourselves and would use this level 3 checklist. This is the RMP, Risk Management Plan Program Level 3 process checklist. And now you notice here, this is EPA. So they always say has the owner or operator. And in OSHA, it's always has the employer. And these are these numbers here are the standard in EPA, but it's exactly the same as OSHA, except again, OSHA starts with the employer shall, and EPA starts with the owner or operator shall. Remember this, that what's OSHA's involved in? The employees. What's EPA involved in? the general public usually. Employees too, but mostly the general public. So there's developed an employee management system to oversee the implementation of the risk management program elements. And this is for endpoints for offsite consequence analysis of a worst case scenario. You have to take a worst case scenario of your biggest tank rupturing and blowing out in like 5 minutes or something like that. And then you have these different things you can use to determine. That's what our environmental guy did. So, but this is a good checklist too. And this is for the release thing, take into account the actual surface characteristics. When you have a release scenario, the computer, if it's released, let's say you're in the middle of a parking lot, it's smooth and nothing there. It's a bit different than if you're in the middle of well, there's trees. So, and then it goes down into a lot of scenarios, process safety information, toxicity, permissible exposure limits, right out of OSHA too, same thing. So the compliance audit is different from a process hazard analysis. It's these questions are developed by EPA or OSHA in the first part I did, but this is the EPA one. So these aren't questions that are developed by us, where in the process hazard analysis, you're basically looking and asking questions on your own, like what happened if we didn't do this, or what would happen if we didn't do that. And that's a good way of doing things, and also get people involved in it. Sometimes they get a little crazy, like we did one when the consultant was there. We're doing a PHA, and he said, "What happened if an airplane crashed into the plant?" And I said, "Wait a minute here, and let's get real, huh? We're not, and if we were under near an airport, under a flight path, I'd say that might be a possibility, but." We're not even close to the airport, and the little planes fly over here on a regular basis. So that is so far out. Why were you even bother with it? And you know what? He agreed to me and took it out. So you can't get crazy on these things. It'd be reasonable. So has the owner or annual certified annually if the operating procedures are current? Remember, you have to certify annually about operating procedures, and they'll have to be reviewed as often as necessary. So you can see that there's the same thing as it's in OSHA and in the plan, in the process safety management standard. And so that's why I'm not going to read it all. I'll just be reading the standard all over again. But they're just asking the question: has the audit been conducted by at least one person knowledgeable in the process? Are the audit findings documented in a report? So it's a really good tool. And section D, there's about hot work permits, and about my contractors, emergency response, and a lot of different things they cover. Risk management plan. So if your response to a release is to evacuate, and notify the first responders and just let the release continue, that's okay. But your company has to make a policy. What are we going to do if we have a release? All right. If you're out in the boonies somewhere and you can just let it blow, then maybe that's the best way. Just let it blow. All right. Don't worry about it. Just evacuate and make sure everybody's upwind of it and or sheltered in place or whatever. But what if you're in a populated area, which most of the OK Foods facilities were, especially one at Fort Smith? They may produce many injuries to civilians and many lawsuits. So whatever you do, you still need a written plan. So we planned to fight it. We planned to go and try to stop it if we could. And so we had to go through that whole 9 yards of level A suits and training, and we did. And it was a lot of work and expense. But we thought if we had a release, we'd want to stop it as much as we could, and do it right by our people too. So that's the last two things we're going to cover on process safety management, because we covered everything else. And that's the process hazard analysis, the PHA. Remember that they have to be updated or validated every 5 years, and you keep them for the life of the process. And the compliance audit in section O, I think it is. The compliance audit has to be done every 3 years, and you only keep the last two. And there's no specific format, although I think the EPA one is most people use, and you can just find it on the internet. And so, all right. That's it for the last thing you're going to see my ugly face about in this course, but I'll probably be seeing you again. In the meantime, be safe. I don't know why this doesn't want to end sometimes. I'll just do this. Well, I guess I won't. There we go.